Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. We are at the beginning of the 2037-2038 offseason. Ended up having a very successful regular season, 102-60 record, best record in baseball, won the NL East for a sixth straight season. We're in the playoffs for a 10th straight season. Unfortunately, in those playoffs, we were knocked out 3-1 in the National League Divisional Series by the ultimate World Series champion Philadelphia Phillies. So our divisional rival ended up taking us out, and then they took out the Cubs and the Orioles, and they swept their first round series against the Rockies on the way to the title. Although we were 10 games ahead of Philadelphia in the standings this year, our record against them in the regular season was 5-8. So that challenge with the Phillies clearly continued in the playoffs, where they won 3 out of 4 against us on the way to that title. So we've got some work to do in this offseason. The issue right now is that we don't have a ton of money to potentially work with. We've got about $2.7 million to work with right now, and that's even if we cut scouting and player development back from where they were a season ago. And we've got a couple of holes to fill. The most significant is going to be at catcher, where Andres Medina is looking for big money for an extension. We also technically need to replace our closer, Chris Bloomquist. Dylan Carlson will be leaving, but that's fine. And Hayden Yinger probably going to be moving on from him as well, although he's not looking for any huge money. So figuring out catcher and closer are the two most obvious holes that we have on the roster right now. For those of you who are wondering, Medina right now is looking for a 5-year deal at a little over $20 million a year. He wants to be able to opt out after year 3. He wants a player option for year 5, and he wants a no-trade clause. He also wants some plate appearances, MVP, and all-star bonuses that are not immaterial if he actually achieves any of those things. So he's looking for pretty good money, but he is a excellent defensive catcher. And if we move on from Medina, who's got 70 ability and a 55 arm, the logical guy to take over would be Walt Miller, who has at times before this year started more often for us than Medina has. He's got 60 catcher ability and a 60 catcher arm. So it's not a massive drop-off defensively, but certainly the borderline exceptional defensive skills of Medina behind the plate are helpful to our team and our pitching staff. If we look at what Walt Miller has done in his 3 years with us in Buffalo, he also played a couple innings at first base this year, but his 3 years with us in Buffalo, catcher ERA of 3.63. When we look at what Funky Cold Medina has done for us over that same time period, and I have to calculate this because he's been with us a little longer, but over his 5 seasons with us, Medina's catcher ERA is 3.48, and over the past 3 years when he has been catching the same exact staff as Miller, it's a bit better at 3.44. So we'd be giving up a bit defensively if we move on from Medina, and I think Medina is certainly arguably a better offensive player at this point too. So there are arguments to bring Medina back, but the only way we're going to be able to afford that is to open up some money in our payroll. Potentially moving on from Pat Mems who ended up missing most of this year with an injury, would be one way to clear up some money. But Mems was our closer before Bloomquist. So that just makes the hole at closer in the back end of our bullpen even higher. Potentially moving on from Joe Edwards, who's going to make about $8 million next year, is another possibility. Potentially moving on from Miller, if we really want to commit to Medina with a long-term deal, would be a way to save some money, because certainly $5 million-ish and then potentially $7 million-ish next year for a backup catcher is getting expensive. No other huge numbers or guys that we obviously want to move on from in terms of arbitration eligible players. But the last option is to perhaps try to trade away Bobby Bolig, which would weaken our offense further, but it would open up a fair amount of money that could enable us to probably bring back Funky Cole Medina if we decide that's the way to go. So before we make those decisions and really get into thinking deeply about those decisions, I want to just take a look back at how all of these players that we are talking about right now and many of our other players actually performed this season. And as I noted earlier, was a very good season for this team on the field. We were the second best team in the National League in terms of runs scored, and we were in the top handful of every batting category except for home runs, where we were 9th, and strikeouts, where we were 10th. So a pretty productive offense, even though we strike out a bit more often than normal, and we don't hit as many home runs as average, which isn't a great combination, but clearly the rest of our team was able to compensate for that. And we were also second in National League in runs allowed. Our starters, after a slow start, finished second in the league in ERA, and our bullpen finished third in ERA. And as you can see here, we were in the top handful of every pitching category, and also one of the better defensive teams in the league this year. So we're heading into this offseason from a position of strength in terms of our pitching staff and our broader roster, but clearly figuring out who's going to be our starting catcher next year is something we need to focus on. Figuring out what we do at third base and or second base if we move on from Joe Edwards is something to think about. Figuring out what we do in the outfield if we move on from Mike Heiner is something to think about. And then figuring out who our closer will be next year is a fourth thing that we will probably prioritize over the coming weeks and months as this offseason begins. So we will take a look at our pitching staff first, and really like our starting rotation. As you can see, everybody won at least 12 games. Everybody started at least 30 games, and all of these players are signed and will be back with us next year. Alexis Barajas, our ace, we now have locked up to a long-term extension at about $21 million a year for 8 seasons. So think that that's pretty decent value for someone who's an Iron Man and who has been a very effective pitcher since he came over to Buffalo. A bit of a down year for him this year, 12-11 record with a 3.13 ERA, year after going 17-7 with a league best 2.39 ERA and earning his first Cy Young Award. But still think that Mr. Barajas is a guy that we are quite happy to have heading up our rotation for the next half decade plus. And unlike Barajas, who had a bit of a down year, our number 2 starter, Sincere Shazier, product of our farm system, had the best season of his career, 14-7, almost a strikeout per inning, 2.82 ERA, and a 4.1 WAR for us. He likewise is signed for several seasons to come, bought out his arbitration years as well as several of his free agent seasons a few years ago, and looking forward to seeing what the two of them can do at the top of our rotation. Alexis Mendoza, the likely National League Rookie of the Year, similar to Shazier, was a fourth-round pick who has developed incredibly well for us. He is fragile physically, which we've been able to avoid in most of our starters over the course of this playthrough, but we're willing to deal with that with the repertoire that he brings to the mound. 24-year-old, throws in the mid to high 90s, and he was 15-7 with a 3.35 ERA, team best 201 and a third innings and 216 strikeouts, 123 ERA plus, 69 FIP minus, and a 6 WAR this year. So he was, at least statistically, the best pitcher we had this year. Juan Estrada is our only lefty among the starters and our two-way guy. His 16-10 record was the most wins he's ever had. His 4.19 ERA was one of his weaker performances in his career. That said, when you look at his Sierra, he kind of was what he always was. But his ERA plus and his FIP minus were both below average this year, just slightly. And his FIP minus has now been below average 2 straight years. 30 years old now. He is another guy who is signed for the next few seasons, and then the team options kick in. So he is someone who, unlike Barajas and Shazier and Mendoza, could be a former wing 2, 3, 4 years from now. But right now, certainly happy to have Estrada doing what he is doing. And while we're talking about Big C, we'll check in on what he did behind or at the plate for us this year. 358 at-bats, hit 282, did draw 51 walks. He was more efficient on the base paths than he'd been in most previous seasons. Still not incredibly efficient with a 70% success rate, but much better than where he had been those past 3 seasons. Batting average dropped almost 60 points, but still draws a lot of walks, gets on base. He is a left-handed hitter, and although he's not a left-handed hitter with any power, with only 2 career home runs, he is still an important player for us against right-handed pitching. 114 WRC plus is a little worse than his career average, but he did give us another 1.7 wins above replacement as a hitter, in addition to what he did for us this year on the mound. I think at this point he's definitely been supplanted as our number 3 starter by Mendoza, but think he still has an important role for us in the future. And then Isidro Ochoa is a guy who made the major league minimum this year. He is finally arbitration eligible, should be making $2.5-3 million next season. 12-6 record this year with a 4.05 ERA. He is certainly not an ace, but he is at this point, relatively cost-effective 5th starter for us. I don't know as his arbitration numbers get higher and higher over the next few seasons that he's someone who's always going to be a 5th starter for us, but certainly at about 2.75 million next year, think that he is a good, solid number 5 starter for us to have back next year. So presumably the starting rotation next year is going to look very similar to the way it looked this year, which is fine, because as we talked about, it was one of the best starting rotations in the National League, which it has been for several years, although we did move on from Jorge Carrillo this year. Alexis Mendoza more than replaced what Carrillo had been doing for us in previous seasons. Turning to the bullpen, Chris Bloomquist is headed to free agency. We picked him up in a trade right before the trade deadline. Struck out 39 batters in 29 2/3 innings for us, saved 19 games. 3.34 ERA was perhaps not as exceptional as we would have hoped, but he was still a productive pitcher while we had him. That said, there's no way he will be back because he is looking for over $100 million for the next 4 seasons. Although he has really good stamina for a reliever, I don't see us making that type of commitment. Clearly, we don't have the money to do it, And as much as I'd love to have him back, we appreciate his efforts down the stretch this year, but he will be finding a new team next season. Lorne Walborn, on the other hand, is an arbitration-eligible player, expected to make $5.5-ish million next year. But we will definitely bring him back. Walborn, who we picked up in a trade with the Dodgers just about 4 years ago, has had an incredible run for us as our stopper. He has led the National League in games all 4 years he's been with us, led the National League in holds all 4 years that he's been with us, and averaged over 140 innings a year while putting up a 2.94 ERA and an aggregate 141 ERA plus and 69 FIP minus over the course of those 4 seasons. So an incredibly valuable arm for us out of the bullpen. 2-time All-Star, 2-time World Series winner with us, and he won the Mariano Rivera Award for us in his first season with us in 2034. Important lefty for us out of the pen. Juan Veliz, another lefty who will be back. He had been with us. We let him leave as a free agent to the Mets. They signed him for more money than we were willing to pay or that we could just afford at that point, given some of the salary dynamics we were jumping through last offseason to ensure that we could bring Deshaun Seifu back, as well as sign Alexis Barajas to an extension. But the Mets have since moved into rebuilding mode, so they were able to, or willing to, retain 45% of his contract when they traded him back to us. He was pretty effective with a 2.11 ERA for us, more than a strikeout per inning after we brought him back, and think that at about $4 million a year for the next couple years, which is what we'll be paying him, he's going to be an important arm in our bullpen. Yohane Varejo, former 5th-round pick, starting to get up there in terms of his arbitration numbers, but had another really nice year for us, 70 strikeouts and 53 1/3 innings pitched, 2.36 ERA. He has been a very effective reliever for us over the years. Conceivably, Veliz or Varejo or even Elvin Jimenez, who we're going to talk about shortly, could end up going into that closer role for us. I think that Walborn's been so successful as a stopper and given us such high quality, high volume that we don't want to change that. But if we don't sign a big-time reliever this offseason, Veliz, Varejo, or Elvin Jimenez, the right-hander, who is going to be starting to make a little bit of money next year, around $4 million, but had a 2.23 ERA for us, 84 strikeouts, and just 4 homers allowed in 64 2/3 innings. So feel like if we have to try to save some money by moving on from Bloomquist and potentially the injured Mems, between Veliz, Varejo, and Jimenez, we've got someone who could close. And with Walborn and those 3 gentlemen, really like what we're going to be throwing at people in the 7th, 8th, and 9th innings. Darnell Polite is a guy that we picked up on waivers before this season. He was fine, 3.77 ERA, did strike out 81 in 74 innings, a bit above average in terms of his ERA plus and his FIP minus. Still at a point where he is making the major league minimum, so feel like he can certainly fill a role in the bullpen for us next year. Maybe time to move on from Hayden Yinger. ERA climbed to 4.59 this year. Yinger is a guy who has been with us since 2028. He was a starter for us primarily the first 6 years he was with us. These last 4 years he's worked out of the pen. Over his career in Buffalo, 3.48 ERA for us, has been a really effective pitcher for us. And he's not looking for incredible money right now, so there's a chance that we would bring him back. Only looking for a little over $2 million a year for 4 years. I don't know that I want to go that long with someone who's going to be turning 38 next season. And don't know that I want to give him a vesting option for his 40-year-old season. But if he's willing to come back at a reasonable price, he is a proven quantity at this point. But we do have other options for our middle and long relief roles if we want to go a little younger and perhaps a little cheaper. Robbie McCracken is a Rule 5 pick. Spent a lot of this year injured, unfortunately, so it was kind of an incomplete season. What I do like about McCracken is that he is inexpensive, and he is a guy who does have a 4-pitch arsenal and enough stamina that we could use him at a spot starter if we had some injuries or needed to. Juan Reynoso, who we traded from Boston back in June, is another guy who kind of fits the same profile. I think he's a better pitcher, but he's also older and he's going to be making a little more money. But he certainly has the stamina and the arsenal that he could be a starter for us in a pinch. He was not good in his limited time in Buffalo. 8.76 ERA and allowed 6 home runs in 24 and 2/3 innings. So a pretty brutal performance, but his SIERA was much better. His BABIP was 389, so he just had a really rough year. Looking at his ratings, I think he's probably a better pitcher than that. He's got ground ball tendencies, throws in the mid to high 90s. The 6 home runs he gave up in 24 and 2/3 innings for us is probably a bit of an aberration. So would expect that Reynoso and or McCracken will be back in our bullpen and as guys who could start if our rotation is not as healthy next year as it was this year. And then David Espinoza, a youngster, gives us a potential left-handed option and out of the bullpen, and also a potential left-handed option who could start for us. He was a 3rd-round pick drafted in 2032. 11-7 with a 5.37 ERA in AAA Albany this year, but we still brought him up in September. Wanted to kind of see if we had anything with him. And he was reasonably productive. 2.81 ERA over 16 innings, got a win, also saved a game for us. Seems like he may have gotten a little lucky when we look at where his SIERA was, but still think that he is a very inexpensive and potentially useful guy who's similar to McCracken and Reynoso, could start for us if we needed to, if we have some injuries, or if we do end up moving on from Misters Estrada or Ochoa over the next 2 to 3 years. Espinoza seems like a guy who could step into a rotation spot at the back end of the starting rotation for us. And 2 pitchers that we didn't mention because they aren't on our roster right now are Eddie Mosley and Pat Mems. We touched on Mems earlier. He was our closer at the start of this year. Has been our closer for almost a season and a half before he had surgery to remove bone chips in his elbow. He's wrecked physically. He's going to turn 33 next year. He has been, over the course of his major league career, a very productive pitcher, whether it was in Boston, Kansas City, or with Buffalo. That said, his arbitration number is expected to be about $8 million next year. I think he is a better pitcher if he is as effective as he has been in the past than Veliz or Varejo or Jimenez, who were 3 of the guys that we were talking about who could end up being our closer next year. But I don't really know that he's worth $8 million, wrecked physically, coming off of an injury in his mid-30s. Very good pitcher, but someone we could look to trade. And then Eddie Mosley, we've got an option year on. He pitched 1 game for us, struck out the only batter he faced, and then was injured. Then during his rehab assignment in Albany, took a setback, surgery to remove bone chips. He is wrecked physically, 33 years old, so about a year older than Mems. He's a lefty. He's a guy who could start or relieve for us, and we do have a team option on him for $1.8 million next year. But with the fact that at this point feel like we've got a lefty who could start or relieve for us in Espinoza, who's much younger and healthier, And we've also potentially got McCracken and Reynoso who could start for us, even though the number next year for Mosley is not incredible at 1.8 million. Do agree with Patrick DeBonis's thoughts from the past episode that he's one guy we can probably move on from if we really want him back. It's very conceivable we could get him for less than we would need to pay him right now. He's also coming off of a relatively serious injury, and he was kind of a borderline roster guy before that who we picked up just because he was cheap and he could start or relieve, and he was a left-handed arm. But now with the fact that we will have Walborn back next year, we've traded back for Valise, and we've now got Espinoza as a youngster coming up. Don't feel as much pressure to keep him as a potential fourth left-handed arm out of the bullpen. So we are going to void the last contract year for Eddie Mosley, and that will free up a little bit of extra money for us as we start making some of these minor moves. But we're going to have bigger decisions to make in the coming days to try to potentially bring back Andres Medina if that's the path that we decide we want to go down. And speaking of Mr. Andres Medina, we will take a look at our position players now. And Medina, as we've talked about with his excellent defensive abilities, has been very helpful to our pitching staff. He got the opportunity to be our starter this year, hit 271, 18 homers, 66 ribbies, 110 WRC plus. So he's had 2 consecutive seasons where he has been really what we hope he could be offensively. And quite honestly, the type of numbers he's put up offensively over these last couple of years, combined with his excellent defense, make him a pretty valuable player. He's got his issues. He's never going to have any extra base hits when you look at his gap power and his lack of speed, although he did have 18 doubles or triples this year. But you get the point. Over 442 at-bats, not an exceptional number. He's going to strike out a ridiculous amount, 126 this year in 442 at-bats, and 126 in 126 games. So good for a strikeout a game from him over the last 3 seasons. But he's durable. He's got some great personality traits. And as we talked about, if he's as productive offensively as he's been these last couple seasons with that personality and that defense and that durability, he is a valuable player. Now, to be fair, these last 2 seasons are the 2 most productive offensive seasons of his career, with the exception of the cup of coffee he got as a 24-year-old in 2032. But he's 30 years old. I don't think he's going to fall off a cliff immediately. Do I necessarily want to give him the 5-year deal with a lot of player optionality at $20 million a year that he's looking for? Probably not. But if we can find some middle ground with him, and if we potentially decide to make some of the moves that I've talked about that would open up some money for us, it's not inconceivable that we at least attempt to bring Mr. Medina back next year. If we are unable to do that, I have already submitted a qualifying offer to him to ensure that if he does move on, we get draft pick compensation. And it's not inconceivable if we can't get a deal to him that he might opt in for that $18.9 million next year, which wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. It's more than I'd like to pay him per season, but it wouldn't be a crippling contract for us to take on, assuming that we do try to sign him and kind of free up some money to make it plausible and palatable for us to potentially bring him back. And if we do move on from Mr. Medina, I feel like we've got a decent option with Walt Miller. As I talked about, he's going to be looking to make around $5 million this coming year and then $7 million next year. So if we do bring Medina back, we may need to move on from Walt Miller to make that happen. But if we can't bring Medina back, he's a guy who's got a little pop in his bat. He does draw some walks. He's above average defensively. Had a brutal year this year when he got the least playing time that he's gotten since he joined us as a clear backup to Medina. Hit just a $167. Did have 9 doubles and 4 home runs and 132 at-bats. So a little bit of pop in his bat. His BABIP was just 237. So I think, looking at these ratings, probably got relatively unlucky. I think it might be a bit ambitious for us to think that we can have both of these guys back next year. Like I said, if we sign Medina, paying close to $5 million a year for a backup catcher seems like a bit of a luxury to me. So we're going to have some interesting decisions to make on that front. Frank Carranza is a left-handed hitter, 7th round pick in 2033. Had a big year across 3 levels of the minors this year, hitting 47 homers between high A ball, double A, and triple A. And he continued to be very productive when we brought him up to Buffalo, 333 average and 5 homers and 96 at-bats. The profile is not exceptional, and he is another guy who is a first base / DH / corner outfielder. So from that perspective, you could say he's not that attractive. He's also low in leadership, which is not attractive. But the thing that differentiates Carranza from most of the guys on our team who are first base / DH / corner outfielders is that he is a left-handed hitter. And you look at his ratings against right-handed pitching, and I think there is definitely a role for him on this team next year against right-handed pitching. And if we do end up moving on from Bobby Bolig to try to free up some money, that certainly increases the role that could be available for Carranza next year. Arturo Flores is kind of the right-handed version of Carranza. He struggled this year, hit just 216, did still have 7 homers and 29 ribbies and 153 at-bats. But for a second straight year, he was a slightly below average offensive player. And with his lack of defense and his lack of speed, all he really brings at this point is his durability, a great personality, and he's useful against left-handed pitching. The issue is we're only going to face left-handed pitching 30 or 40 times a year. So he's still making the major league minimum next year. So from that perspective, a guy that we will likely have around, but he's a guy whose roster spot is also likely to be in jeopardy potentially next season and certainly in years to come with guys like Carranza, younger and potentially better or at least more useful. Speaking of useful, Joe Gallagher, number 9 prospect in baseball, a 9th round pick in 2034, who has just developed incredibly surprisingly for us. Another guy who is a first baseman / corner outfielder who is slow, can't play defense, some personality quirks, but he was a above average offensive player for us this year. After a couple of monstrous seasons in the minors the last few years where he hit 74 home runs in 2035 and he hit 64 home runs primarily in the minors in 2036. Played the full year in the majors this year, hit 237 with 37 homers and 109 ribbies. The 109 ribbies were 3rd in the National League, and those home run and ribby numbers were the highest on our team. With 202 strikeouts and that low batting average, his WRC plus of 108 was only a little bit above average, and he was really only a little bit above replacement level because He primarily is a DH and brings nothing to the table defensively, as we've talked about, but still a pretty important bat for us. And although he's better against left-handed pitching, he at least has the pop in his bat that he could be a useful guy for us against right-handed pitching as well. Certainly a guy that for the next few years is likely to have a roster spot on our team. And speaking of a guy who will have a role on our team, we'll turn our attention to Deshaun Seifu, who we signed to a 5-year extension this past offseason. We do have a team option after the 3rd year, and then he's got a player option for the 5th year of this contract. But Seifu shows no signs of slowing down, led the National League in steals for a 10th consecutive season, led the National League in hits for a 5th consecutive season and a 6th time overall, and led the National League in triples for the 6th time in his career as well. He is an Iron Man, and even though he's 33 years old, his speed is still holding up. His contact and his gap power, I think, are trending a little bit negative. But this is a guy who we picked number 1 overall in 2026, the 1 year we had the first overall pick. And he is closing in, hopefully, on a Hall of Fame career. Got his 2000th hit back in August. Looks like he could conceivably join Rickey Henderson in the 1,000 steal club probably 2 to 3 years from now. Going to be tough for him to get his career batting average over 300 when all is said and done. He has hit over 300 for 5 straight years now, so it's conceivable that in the next year or two he might get that average over 300, but I would think that when he gets into his mid to late 30s and his speed goes a little bit, he'll probably have some more years where he's hitting 270, 280, 90 that will ensure that he's not a 300 career hitter. But with a 62 career WAR, I think that he is certainly a candidate for the Hall of Fame, and hopefully he will end up there. And I think he's got a shot at being the National League MVP this year. His 7.1 WAR was the second best in the league. 7.2 was the highest number. And Seifu was on a 102 win team that had home field advantage. The other 2 guys with WARs over 7 were on teams with losing records. So I think that if there's ever going to be a year that Seifu is the MVP, perhaps this season is it. Joe Edwards is perhaps the most interesting decision we have to make this offseason. Former second-round pick in 2027, and he had the worst year of his career for us this year as our full-time third baseman. Batted just .211 and struck out 166 times. Didn't walk quite as much as a year ago. His on-base percentage of .319 was poor by his standards, and hit a 99 WRC plus. Now, he's only 28 years old, and he had a 130 WRC plus each of the last 2 seasons, so it's conceivable that he'll have a bounce back year next season. $8-ish million next year for a guy with a 99 WRC plus is hard for me to justify. If he goes back and he does what he did the previous years, we probably keep him around. So that's going to be a real interesting decision for me, because Edwards does probably still have some trade value. He's got home run power. He's got an incredible eye. He can play a ton of positions. But there is a part of me thinking if we move on from Edwards, that would allow us to move Seifu back to third base, where he has played for us at times in the past. Seifu would be a small upgrade defensively to Edwards at third base, most likely. And then we could look to maybe bring on a better defensive second baseman than Seifu and kind of start trying to upgrade our defense a bit, given that other than Seifu, Barajas, Estrada, and Sincere Shazier are three pitchers who are people that we have invested heavily in, that we're going to be paying a lot of money to over the next few years. So we probably want to support them with as much defense and as quality defense as possible. So if we move on from Edwards, it kind of opens up a spot at third or at second for us, depending on which direction we want to go. Steve Anderson, the young shortstop, bit of a down year offensively, hit .238 with 14 homers, 91 WRC plus, had a 2 WAR. He's a solid defensive shortstop with a decent bat. The issue is he's now arbitration eligible, so he's going to start making a little bit of money at $3.5–4 million. Happy to have him back next year. Is he the long-term answer at short? I'm not sure. We do also have Tim Hull coming back, who we've signed to be kind of a super utility guy for us, although he has really ended up more in a platoon role with Anderson, since he bats right-handed and Anderson bats left-handed at shortstop the last couple of years. 99 WRC plus, had a decent bounce back year. Similar to Anderson, he is a competent defensive shortstop. He's not Ozzie Smith, but he is not Roy Smalley out there defensively at shortstop either. 251 average this year, 18 doubles and 219 at-bats. We've got him signed at that $6 million number for another couple years to be a utility infielder for us. And then we've got team options for a couple years after that. Hull conceivably is a guy who could move back to a starting role, say at second base, if we did decide to move on from Edwards and move Seifu to third. Bench would be a little weaker, but we've got some options down in AAA that could help. And now we turn to the outfielders. And Bobby Bolig is a guy who's had some really big years for us, but the last couple years is not trending in a great direction. Hit .261 this year with 15 homers in 403 at-bats. Ended up hurt at the end of the year and for all of the playoffs, unfortunately. 116 WRC plus is certainly productive. Stole 29 bases for us, so he is also still useful on the base paths. But he is a guy who is making in the mid to high teens for the next 4 years before some team options kick in. And if we decide that we need to find $15, $16, $17, $18 million to bring Andres Medina back as our catcher, I think potentially considering moving on from Bolig is a logical way to do that, with the fact that with the left-handed hitting Carranza, I think we can get similar production at this point to Bolig, because Bolig, while he is still an above-average profile against right-handed pitching, is not quite as strong-looking as he was a few years ago and is now fragile physically. So Bolig, to me, is a guy to consider moving on from. Alex Fellers, a guy we claimed on waivers earlier this season, ended up splitting the year between Buffalo and AAA, although quite honestly, primarily in AAA, where he was productive. Like the left-handed bat, he is a guy who is making the major league minimum if we keep him around. The issue is that he's out of minor league options, so we would have to waive him to get him down to AAA. But particularly if we moved on from Bolig, Fellers feels like a guy who can give us maybe similar production against right-handed pitching with much less speed and somewhat less defensive proficiency. So not a perfect replacement, but also a guy who could be in the mix. Mike Heiner, former first-round draft pick, who we signed to a long 10-year major league deal before he had ever played in the majors. Still not making crazy money, and he's really not making crazy money in any of these years. So he, to us, is an important left-handed bat for us. has a nice profile, has some speed, so he's able to get some extra base hits, although the speed I guess, has dipped a bit over the past year. No triples, but he did have 33 doubles, 17 homers, 100 ribbies, 300 batting average, and a 121 WRC plus. Again, you look at what he is defensively, and to me, he is a pretty cost-effective version of Bolig. Better than Fellers, probably better than Carranza. Maybe not better than Bolig, although the way his ratings are trending, he could be at this point. So feel between Heiner definitely being on the Major League roster, Estrada definitely being on the Major League roster, Carranza likely being on the Major League roster, and Fellers possibly being on the Major League roster, that if we do move on from Bolig, we probably have enough left-handed bats to not be completely inept against right-handed pitching. One left-handed bat that we haven't talked about that won't be back with us is Dylan Carlson. Picked him up in a trade with Boston. They retained a big chunk of his contract. He was our starting center fielder against both righties and lefties when the year started. We demoted him, so he was only playing against lefties after about the All-Star break. And then when we got to September call-ups, he was out of the starting lineup entirely. Hit just a .171, struck out in about a third of his at-bats, 60 WRC plus. Unlikely that he will be back with us next year, and particularly given that he's still looking for $8 million a year over 3 years after that season. We wish him well. Ben Elmquist, who was a first-round pick in 2034, another left-handed bat, and he's one of the guys who took playing time from Carlson in September when he came up. Elmquist was named the International League MVP this year, hitting .322 with 30 homers and 122 ribbies. Hit .385 in a very small sample size of 26 Major League at-bats for us, but feel with his defensive versatility and his good outfield range and the fact that he is a lefty hitter, although he doesn't have a ton of power, think that he will likely be a pretty cost-effective option in the outfield for us for the next few seasons. And he'll likely be competing for playing time in center field and trying to win a full-time center field role with Tim Gaglia and Tyreek Hardage. Gaglia ended up injured during the playoff series, but he had the best year of his major league career at this point, just in terms of the opportunity that he was given, quite honestly. Ended up starting 112 games for us, hit .287, 104 WRC plus. He's a guy who's proven to be a bit above average as an offensive player. Not much home run power, but he does generate some extra base hits. Doesn't walk a lot, which isn't great, but he's pretty good on the base paths. 22 of 26 stealing this year, had the 7 triples and 36 doubles. He's very good defensively. He's got some speed. He is a guy who is now finally arbitration eligible, so he's going to be making a little bit more money, but think that he, at this point, is still a pretty cost-effective guy to have on the squad. And Tyreek Hardage is quite honestly a similar situation. He's going to be making probably a little over $2 million next year. Another center fielder who came up through our system, a second-round pick in 2028. He has, unfortunately, unlike Gaglia, never been an above-average offensive player for us. So closing in on 28 years old, I think Hardage is getting close to the point where, with Gaglia and Elmquist both around, playing time is probably going to be a little more of a challenge for him. And ultimately, in the next year to 2 to 3 years, his spot on the 26-man roster could certainly be in doubt. That said, the things that I like about him compared to certainly Gaglia and to a lesser extent Elmquist is that there has been a little bit of pop in Hardage's bat. 10 home runs and 297 at-bats a year ago. He's another guy with very good speed, was 12 for 12 on the base paths, and another guy who's very good defensively with a lot of range in the outfield, can play any position. Is a fourth or fifth outfielder. I still like him. And if you think about potentially moving on from Bolig, moving on from Carlson, there is an opportunity for the likes of Fellers and Hardage to be joining Heiner, Elmquist, and Gaglia on our 26-man roster next year. And before finishing the episode, I'll mention one other guy who's never played in the majors but could have a role for us next year, particularly if we do decide to move on from Joe Edwards. And that is the infielder Tegan Tiley. You may remember him. He was our first-round pick out of Canada back in 2031. He's 25 years old at this point, and he has not made his major league debut. We would have called him up this past season, but he was injured in September. So unfortunately, he didn't get to make his major league debut. Hit 270 with 19 homers in AAA for us this year. 102 WRC plus, so he was a bit above average offensively after being below average last year in his first AAA action. Don't think he is a big-time player for us. The downsides are that he's fragile. And that the bat is kind of meh, but not horrible. He does have a little bit of pop, and he's not bad at anything. He's not particularly fast. He's not particularly good defensively, but he can play a lot of positions defensively, and he'd clearly be making the major league minimum for the next 3 years once we bring him up. So if we do end up moving on from Edwards, Tegan Tiley could certainly be in the mix to be on the team next year, if not as a starter, certainly as a utility infielder, particularly if we moved Hull to be our starting second baseman, had Anderson at short, and Seifu at third. Tegan Tiley could certainly fit in with those guys, and although I don't think he has the offensive upside of a Joe Edwards, he is a lot more cost-effective and almost as versatile defensively, and, as I said, younger and more cost-effective. So Tiley could be in the mix for us as well. So that is our 2037 season. Kind of reviewed all of the major league guys, gave you some thoughts on what we might look to do this offseason. If you have any ideas, always love to hear them in the comments. In our next episode, we're going to take a look at some prospects around baseball, and then perhaps most interestingly, we're going to take a look at some of our former players, because we have some pretty prominent former players on other teams now, that some of whom we've moved on from willingly, and some of whom we've moved on from with great reservations because we couldn't afford to bring them back. And we'll take a look at how all of those players performed this past season before jumping in fully into how we're going to try to remake this roster for next year. So if you've got ideas on what we should do, as I mentioned, as always, I like to hear those in the comments. It's always interesting to hear other perspectives, even if I don't necessarily follow them or agree with them. Always learn something when people comment, so I appreciate that. If you're still listening, and well, first of all, if you're still listening, thank you so much for still listening. And if you are still listening and you haven't subscribed to the channel, would sincerely appreciate it if you do, and help us keep trying to grow this little corner of the YouTube universe. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.